of Public Finance and Policy. Please come on to the dais. I invite Shri V. Ananta, Dean IFMR Business School, Kira University. Please come to the dais. I invite Shri Satish Marathe, Part-time Director, RBI and Patron Sehkari Bank. Please come to Sehkar. I invite Shamika Ravi, Member Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister and Director of Research, Brookings India. I also invite Mr. Shaurya Doval, Member of the Board of Governors, India Foundation, and to conduct the further proceedings.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Chandavadaji. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a slight change in plan. We were supposed to have Mr. PIYUSH GOYAL deliver the keynote address to start this session, but he's still on his way, so we're just turning this on its head. We'll start with the panel discussion, and then PIYUSH will join us subsequently in a few minutes, and then we'll wind it up with his keynote address. So that's the way we will run the format for this session. This session, an agenda for inclusive economic prosperity. The way we thought we'd run this is that I'll ask each of the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will open the floor for question and answers for another 10-15 minutes, and by that time we'll have PIYUSH as well, and he can follow it up with his address. Economic prosperity of India, or economic growth in India, is now pretty much inevitable and a foregone conclusion. I think, depending upon how things pan out, the kind of administrations we have, the rate of growth can increase or decrease. But whether India is on an upward economic trajectory and an economic journey, that debate is by and large settled. But the larger debate still remains, which is that how will this economic prosperity that comes the nation's way be distributed? Will it be inclusive? What form will it take? How will we carry all the people of this country along with us? And what implications it will have for our polity in the years to come? So that is what I would request the panelists to at least give us their views as to how can this economic prosperity that is coming our way be more inclusive. And with that, I'd request Ilaji, who's the first speaker, to take the stage, or if she wants to sit and talk, whichever way is convenient with her.
Good afternoon. First of all, let me thank India Foundation for inviting me here. It's a pleasure, it's a delight to be given the opportunity to speak to all of you. I think what we need to begin with, before we talk about what might be the policies that we would like to see going forward, is a little bit of where we are and where we've come from, and what we need to change for having inclusive growth. I mean, inclusive growth, or a growth that has economic prosperity and delivers it to all citizens, all the people of the country who should have the ability to earn their livelihood. And I'm not saying jobs, I'm saying earn their livelihood, who should have the opportunity to have a good quality of life, is something that is of utmost importance looking forward. I just want to take us back to this morning, and when people, and even yesterday evening, when people talk about India and India through the centuries, then we were talking about a country, an economy where there was trade, commerce, business, crafts that were growing and flourishing for many, many centuries. It is well known how India was trading with many of her neighbors through various land routes, through various maritime routes. What is interesting is that that was a time when there were least restrictions So for example, I work on the rupee and macroeconomics, so my examples would be more related to those. So for example, the rupee was used not just in India, but it was used for trade in many other countries as well. In fact, going all the way to the 1950s, the rupee was accepted as legal tender in the Middle East, in Kuwait, in many other countries other than India. The reason I point this out, and the reason I want us to remember that there is a history to what we want to do today, is to bring to your notice the fact that all the changes, the restrictions that were put on the economy, the socialist orientation of the economy really began in the 1960s. In fact, in the mid-60s. And it is from then onwards that we said, how much can you produce? Who can you sell to? At what price can you produce? You need a license for new industry. You need a license to import. You cannot use the rupee without the permission of the Reserve Bank. Nobody abroad can hold the rupee. And various other controls, both on production, on imports, on exports, the whole license Raj that we talked about. And it was that legacy that continues, a part of that legacy that continues even today. It is, of course, as all of us know, in 1991, that because growths under the regime of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s that we had put in place and almost restricted economic activity, restricted commerce, restricted trade, limited the use of our currency so much that what we got was very, very slow growth leading to a crisis. And in 91, when we did a reform, then we did a partial reform. Just to go back to what does the word reform mean? Reform fundamentally refers to countries like ours, emerging economies, that had put government restrictions in place. And it fundamentally refers to undoing many of those restrictions and doing away with excessive state intervention in the economy. So the agenda for reforms that was undertaken in 91 did, of course, do away with import licensing, did away with industrial licensing, and a lot of other restrictions that on exports and on trade that had been put. But what it did not do and left undone and is still halfway done and is in the process of doing, which is what I feel are the critical things to be done for inclusive growth and prosperity today, are things such as financial sector reform, reform in agriculture. Now, if we look at what happened in agriculture and in banking and other parts of the financial sector, including bond market, derivatives, including currencies, is that the system that prevailed from the 60s to the 90s, so 50 years, we've had 50 years of public sector banks, now we've had excess capital controls in many, many parts of the economy. That system was not changed, partly because of the entrenched bureaucratic interests, partly because of the fear of the political class, and partly because of vested interests that sought to use many of the resources. I mean, many of you would be aware of how often bureaucrats go and use public sector bank facilities, whether at home or in abroad, whether it is guest houses, whether it is cars, whether, many, many other things. So it is vested interests which, from the 90s till, we see the political class, we see the bureaucracy, as well as those the various regulators who have entrenched interests in those that have not allowed reform to happen. I would emphasize financial sector reforms, which is a field that I've been working on in my job as professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, where we have understood that when an economy is doubling its GDP every 10 years, which an economy like India growing at 7.5% growth rate is doing so, financial sector has to keep pace with it. And unless we reform the financial sector, which is the brain of the economy, people who, the young of the economy, the demographic dividend we often talk about, who may have worked very hard to acquire the education, acquire the skills, need to be able to get access to capital, need to be able to get access to finance, to be able to put their dreams, to be able to put them in place, to be able to get the opportunities that they want, to convert those opportunities into means of earning their livelihood, whether it is in rural India, whether it is in small towns, in the agricultural sector, all over the country. Finance and the old style of finance that we've had is giving money to a few, is giving money to the government, to some priority sector lending institutions. It is giving money to things like, now they're in big trouble, but various companies, either directly or through non-bank financial intermediaries. But the extent to which small businesses get loans is clearly still inadequate. The very fact that after 50 years of bank nationalization, we had to start a scheme called Mudra, which asked banks to target loans to small businesses, meant that the very objective of bank nationalization, which was to give finance to bulk of the population and access to rural India and to small loans, had failed. Had it succeeded, had there been adequate levels of competition, adequate levels of independence or functioning of that system, what you would not have had to, after 50 years, direct banks to undertake such an exercise. To go back to what I believe is necessary for economic growth that is inclusive, economic growth that brings prosperity to everybody, is that the government prioritize and goes back to doing the basic function of government. So expenditure, for example, should be prioritized to public goods, law and order, justice system, roads, clean air, clean water. Public goods where the market fails to deliver, rather than those things, rather than running airlines or industries or various businesses or banks. If there is this prioritization, it is far more equal for the poor, for the rich, for everybody who lives in the country and wants access. The inclusion should focus on access to opportunity. So people who live in remote areas are better off if they have access to roads. And I think everyone in this country understands that only the state can do law and order and justice, and the state has to deliver. And the state has to deliver on those things. So even in terms of reform, I would say that the priority that we have to put in place is to minimize interference in the state in markets, regulate markets. When markets fail, then it is the job of the state to regulate markets. It is the job of the government to make markets function. But fundamentally, we have been for hundreds of years a market-based economy, and despite the 50 years in which most of us were born and brought up, and therefore which changed the way we think about how much the state should do and do more and more and more, we need to get out of that, and that for me is what will give us inclusive economic prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ila, for giving us a historical context of the reforms and the need to take sort of the next generation of reforms that will lead to a much more inclusive growth. May I now invite Anant Nageshwaran, Dean IFMR, to give us his views on this agenda.
Thank you, Shaurya. Thank you, India Foundation, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for us is how to make prosperity inclusive. But have we in India locked in an enduring cycle of prosperity? We need to face that question front and square, because the answer to that question will also ensure or determine the success of the outcome on inclusion. Frankly, the answer to that question from my perspective, have we locked in a cycle of enduring prosperity? The answer is no. Pre-2008, India's economic growth was a function of lot of one-off serendipitous factors. And we assumed that we had arrived as a fast-growing nation. The 2008 crisis put paid to those claims that we had arrived as a fast-growing nation. Post-2008, we resumed growth, but as a consequence of extremely reckless government spending policies and also monetary policy. That is why in 2013, we had a collapse of the Indian rupee, a rising current account deficit, and 5 years of double-digit inflation in the country up to 2014. Now, 2014 to 2016, we witnessed a collapse in global crude oil prices, and therefore the economy rebounded, and there were some very important deregulation initiatives by the new government, including financial inclusion, the Prime Minister's Jan Dhan Yojana, etc., targeted delivery of government benefits. All those things happened. But post-2016, partially due to the effects of demonetization and partially due to the rebound in oil price and partially due to the consequences of lending that was made post-2008 and also subsequently, the non-performing loans issue began to dominate the headlines, and that has capped economic growth, and now that has spilled over into the non-banking financial world as well. So in a way, the recurrent cycles of rising current account deficits, rising non-performing loans, actually do send us a very clear reminder that we have not yet ensured a self-sustaining cycle of prosperity in this country. We have to face it. Our maximum growth, the speed limit at this point in time seems to be less than 7% and not above that. Only by accepting this reality, we can then decide what we need to do to make it a sustainable annual growth rate of 7 or even 8%. We need to first accept that reality that we may be temporarily, for statistical reasons, the fastest growing economy in the world, large economy in the world, but we are not a sustainably fast growing economy yet. Why is it that? That's because we have not invested or thought adequately about productivity. Whenever we mention productivity, we always think of infrastructure. We don't have ports, roads, airports, connectivity, etc., which hold down our productive potential. That is definitely true, but that is getting addressed. That is getting addressed in many parts of the country. You see metro stations, new rail, roads, highways, etc. Energy capacity is increased, etc. But our productivity problems also arise from our attitude towards work and also the amount of time we spend in terms of scoring political points rather than working on productivity. In my last column in Mint, I wrote that India may have a twin deficit problem in economics, fiscal deficit and current account deficit. But India has a twin surplus problem, which impinges on productivity. And that twin surplus problem is the problem of big egos and small minds. And that is a very big deterrent to productivity. In organizations, whether it is social, non-profit, for-profit, etc., that is a hurdle on productivity and therefore on prosperity. So we are a productivity challenged, an attitude challenged nation, and therefore we haven't yet locked in prosperity, and we need to work on that. And that is why we frequently run into crisis of finance, crisis of current account deficit and inflation, and that pull us back. After achieving 2-3 years of 7+ growth, we again get pegged back to 5 and 6%. So we need to face that. The second aspect is inclusive growth. Yes, actually, we have taken some very important measures in the recent years. And as I mentioned, one of them is the Prime Minister's Jan Dhan Yojana. And financial inclusion is now really happening through this initiative. It is not just a question of opening bank accounts. We have academic studies corroborating the fact that these accounts are being used for transactions and they are not simply empty, idle accounts. That's a good thing. That is for individuals. But what about small businesses? Access to credit remains a big barrier for medium and small businesses. And it is not just coming from banks. It is not that the banks alone are responsible for denying access to credit. The bigger problem than bank finance access is the problem of working capital for small and medium businesses. And that comes because big businesses don't pay on time for supplies received from small manufacturers. And that is why a very micro initiative, you might think it's a matter of detail, but the devil is in the detail, or the angel is in the detail, which is that the Receivables Corporation of India Limited, which the Government of India set up after 7 years of deliberations, is a very important step. It is about factoring the receivables so that companies can discount the bills that they're supposed to receive from big buyers, and the banks will pay them in advance, and the banks will then collect the receivables from the big companies so that the working capital needs of small businesses do not get affected because big businesses don't pay them on time. And that is a very important initiative, but unfortunately, the private corporate sector is actually stalling this initiative. Most of us who think the problem in India is the government and the bureaucracy must rethink. India's private sector is as much part of the growth and prosperity problem as the government, if not more. And that is what we are witnessing with this crisis in the banking, bad debts, assets, etc. It is the private sector problem which the banks are facing. So inclusion means access to credit, access to working capital for small and medium businesses. Second is the farm sector, because still roughly 50% of the economy lives in rural India. And when you say farm sector, the only thing we are hearing about and reading about are loan waivers, which we know are not permanent solutions, but they have become permanent policy initiatives no matter which party is in office, in the state or at the union government level. But the real issues are in terms of irrigation facilities, access to irrigated arable land, and more importantly, absence of restrictions on how much farmers can sell, to whom, and at what prices. If that empowerment of farmers happens, because we have minimum export prices determined by Government of India when it should be determined by the market. But we are actually thwarting the farmers' ability to take advantage of global prices. So therefore, you cannot have an inclusive prosperity or economic growth with restrictions on the farm sector, on what farmers can do. Empowering farmers means empowering them to sell quantities at the price that the market will allow them. Then we can talk about inclusive prosperity. And lastly, in order to talk of inclusive prosperity, we need to rely on the benefits of facilitating economic activity and not on economic policing. In the last couple of days, we have seen some statistics which are very heartening on the direct taxes collection in the last 2 years. Partially, it is a success story of greater surveillance, collection efforts, etc. But partially, it is also a reflection on an extortionary tax department as well. Both are true. So we need to remember that we need to go back to the idea that government should primarily be a facilitator and not a policeman when it comes to economic activity. If these broad principles are kept in mind, we can not only achieve prosperity, but it will also be inclusive prosperity. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Anand. For first, of course, questioning the very fact that, India is not locked in a cycle of economic prosperity, and then coming up with some ideas that not only we achieve economic prosperity, but make it sustainable. I will now request Shri Satish Marathe ji to please come and give us his views on how we can move forward with an inclusive economic agenda.
Namaskar. For inclusive, sustainable growth and for increasing the prosperity of our countrymen, I feel on three steps we need to take as early as possible and more effectively. First is the spread of financial literacy. As a banker for over 40 years, it has been my experience that the best of educated are not necessarily financially literate. And the value of money and the value of its circulation is also not properly understood. So in our country, we need to take special efforts to improve the financial literacy. The Reserve Bank, the Indian Banks Association have come out with small programs, and these need to be organized in every possible place. The second area where we need to concentrate is empowerment of the women. It is debatable whether half of our population is below the poverty line or above the poverty line. But my years of experience in while working in a tribal area is that if we financially empower a woman, she not only supports her immediate family, but also takes care of the larger family. And financial empowerment, particularly for women who are less educated or uneducated, the best route is formation of self-help groups and joint liability groups. We have in our country about 85 lakh self-help groups. 73 lakhs of it relate to women. But just 2/3 of this self-help groups are financially linked to the banks or credit societies or such financial institutions. But the average loan per self-help group is just 1,27,000. If you divide this 1,27,000 by about 15 women in a typical self-help group, the credit that a woman gets is too small, and it really does not much help to increase her income levels. There is another problem also in this area, and that is to improve the skills of the members of the self-help group. There are just 3,800 training institutes in the country. And annually, training is imparted to not more than 5 lakh women. Unless we improve their skills, their earning capacity is not going to increase. And this is one area where we need to concentrate. We have banks, we have district central cooperative banks, and the state national rural livelihood mission in 27 states that promote the self-help groups. But the self-help groups are largely organized by NGOs, and they just number 5,000 in our country. We need, if not another 85 lakh self-help groups in our country, at least 50 lakhs to make a positive impact, not only in the rural sector, but also in the urban sector. There is a feeling generally that the monies lent to SHGs may be lost. But our experience over the past 8 to 10 years has been, though the NPAs have increased, even today, they just hover around 6.5%. So for sustainable, equitable growth and to increase the income levels of the poorer sections, I feel as a country we need to concentrate more and take more effective steps to promote SHGs and JLGs both in urban and rural areas. There is another sector which we need to concentrate. Of course, the focus of the government has been on the agricultural and allied agricultural activities. But the medium through which we should really have concentrated and given a push was to have been the cooperative sector. In fact, the share of the cooperative sector in agricultural sector in our country, whether it is for rural credit, delivery of rural credit, distribution of inputs or fertilizers, or for providing other services, has sharply come down in the last few years. The share has come down mainly on account of two reasons. One, the others, the public sector banks and to some extent the private sector banks have started deploying funds in the agricultural sector. And the second has been a part of the cooperative sector has been rendered weak. I feel a country which is the largest cooperative movement in the world with over 8.5 lakh cooperative societies and a total membership exceeding 25 crores, we need to give special attention to this sector. The United Nations has estimated that by 2030, the requirement of food is going to double in the world over, and India is not going to be exception to that. To increase the income levels and thus to make the farmers participants in our growth process and to ensure inclusive growth, what we need to do as a country is provide processing facilities to the farmers at their doorstep. It is technically feasible, it is possible that such processing activity can be carried out in small villages and at the doorstep of the farmers. Such an activity, I am sure, will not only increase the shelf life of our agricultural produce, which is substantially wasted, will add value to our agricultural produce and eventually increase the income of our farmers. This is an activity which we all need to concentrate as a country. And when I am talking of agriculture, I would also like to talk about the allied agricultural activities, whether it is dairy, whether it is animal husbandry, which includes sheep, goat rearing, poultry. All these areas also we need to promote, and I believe this needs to be taken up on a big scale across the whole country. The last point which I would like to speak about is empowerment of our youth. Today, every year, lakhs of youth are coming out with and seeking jobs. And jobs are not going to be easily available, whether in rural or urban areas. Some of the figures that I got when we were reading about the employment situation in various parts of the country, it transpired that the organized sector in a typical 10 to 6, 8 to 4 shift-like employment opportunities, world over it does not exceed anywhere 20%. And that's going to be the situation in our country also. So instead of talking of employment, it is high time all of us, including the government, should, instead of using the word employment, should start speaking about income earning opportunities. And these are abundant in across the country. There is dearth of people, not only at the base level, but at the middle and higher level also, where we need competent people for our economic activities. Hence, the skill building activities which have got a big push after 2014 should be reviewed, and it should be made available to all the youth in our country so that they also become and have opportunity to earn their livelihood. Only when the income levels will rise in our country of our underprivileged sections, I think we should be able to achieve equitable, sustainable and inclusive growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Satish ji, for actually pointing out some specific tools like financial empowerment or the use of cooperative sector in bringing about this inclusive economic development. I will now request Shamika to be the next speaker. You want to sit and do? Yeah. Use this mic.
In the interest of time and also because most of these diocese are biased against people under 5.5 feet. So let me just, and also this is home crowd, this is family. Let's keep it informal. There are some points that I'd like to convey to you through this forum. First of all, I'm very glad that this is a citizens forum, citizens manifesto. It's very important, and at the end of it, I will tie it down to why eventually it does end down. It is way beyond a problem that can be tackled by governments and laws. Eventually, it is about ownership of citizens. But let me start by saying that, inclusive growth, we've had a fair bit of difference in experimentation over the last 25 years in the country. We are seeing different states emerge in very different ways. In fact, some of our breakout states in the country are Uttarakhand, Sikkim, Gujarat, etc. And they have all had very different trajectories. They have had growth, but they have also had reduction in poverty and reduction in poverty across demographic groups, okay? So it is not just about urban, it is also rural, it is not just a majority in terms of general population, it's also OBCs, SC, STs, etc., minorities and all. So it's important to understand that there is an ingredient, there is a recipe for inclusive growth, and some states have shown us that it is possible. Now, equitable growth or inclusive growth, there are fundamental aspirations of citizens, and that has to do with equality and opportunity. Eventually, as a government, the idea is to make available opportunities to people to grow. Outcomes cannot be ensured. I cannot make sure that if I give each of you the same treatment in this room, all of you will respond similarly to it. People will have different responses. So inequality in the long term is also something we should be acceptable towards. Inequality will remain, but what is an acceptable inequality is the debate that we should have here. What is an acceptable level of inequality? Towards that equality in opportunity, which means we should see considerable economic mobility. We should see people from the 5th quintile move to the 4th and 3rd and so on and so forth. People should do well in life. So mobility exactly has to do with, are these opportunities now becoming available? And towards that, the only recipes that governments can really do are provide infrastructure. That's why I will not discount the role of infrastructure. Infrastructure is fundamental to inclusive growth. We have had tremendous amount of research come from development literature, globally, a lot of it from India, which says that when you give roads and electricity, you do have growth. And growth is not just about big 20 industrialists. Growth is about small micro enterprises, individuals with 2 cows. You can sell the milk, get to 4 cows, and so on and so forth. So that is growth. Second is infrastructure, also from the soft infrastructure sense. And that is one place where I think India, we have a lot to catch up. We have not made the early investment into human capital. Strong, powerful, fast-growing countries cannot be built on sick, dumb population. We need to have good investments, good reforms. We need to be able to put human capital at the center of our next stage of reforms. So we've done remarkably well, particularly in the last 5 years, in hard infrastructure, electricity, roads, ports, and everything else that you've heard of before. Human capital is where we are trying to make the push. And that's why Ayushman Bharat becomes very, very critical. Human capital involves education and health primarily. Now let me give you a sense of, why, if you look at the diverse, the variations across the country, not only do you have regional and in some sense state-wise variation, we have a remarkable rural-urban variation as well, okay? One of the leading cause of that is we have to recognize that cities have become, it's not just states, a few cities have become the engines of growth in our country. And that's a good thing. The point is, how do you get tier 3 and tier 4 to also be able to emulate that, get the governance structure, have strong urban local body, invest in technology, bring industry, prosper, okay? So we have to recognize that engines of growth also have a certain recipe. We have to be willing to do that. And that is where the Smart Cities mission has been successful and has potential to be a lot more successful by attracting investments and leading to future prosperity. If you look at, I just want to give you one statistics, because this is all close to home and this is domestic crowd. If you look at health outcomes, wealth outcomes we have been closely capturing across the country for the last 25 years. If you look at health outcome, then the situation is actually not so great because, the top quintile in Uttar Pradesh, meaning the richest 20% of Uttar Pradesh, have child health outcomes which are actually worse than the bottom 20% of states like Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra. So the richest people in UP, their children are unhealthier than the poorest 20% people in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu. That has to tell us something about the nature of reforms required at the local level. We need to be able to put emphasis back on human capital, okay? And that is again an emphasis why Ayushman Bharat becomes critical. The second point is, I think, it is a citizens' manifesto. This is, I think, one of the most remarkable legacy of NDA2 will be Swachh Bharat. Swachh Bharat has managed to make a kickstart and actually a remarkable transition if you look at the numbers for something which I call culture of growth. It is really about discipline, it's about hygiene, it's about personal hygiene. And those are things which, as economists, we have traditionally discounted very heavily. But they amount in the long term remarkably, important as far as productivity growth is concerned. So inclusive growth will require these kind of citizens' manifesto. Swachh Bharat is something that we should be particularly proud of and sort of keep improving upon. But a lot of this has to do with mass movements. This has to go beyond a couple of states, a couple of cities, and some policies. And this is where I think moving forward, if we were to have a discussion on what can we do now, we have to make a distinction that, economic reforms 1.0 were essentially about the product market and trade, and we were liberalizing largely just from the product side. The factor side, land, labor, we have made some change. But we have to think hard about water. about issues like gender, again, going back to health and other issues. That is what Economic Reforms 2.0 will be about. We have to make a distinction between what is pro-business and what is pro-market. I think while we do have economic and social, we do have social and political right and left in this country, unfortunately, when it comes to economic policy, most of our experts are left and more left. We need to have a serious discussion on what is pro-market. Pro-market does not mean pro-business. Pro-market means more competition, because eventually, the more competition you have, the more the investments will be in terms of productivity enhancements or technological progress, more efficiency. Eventually, competition is good for citizens. It's good for consumers. And that's why competition is very important, and market is going to be, is in fact our effort towards Economic Reforms 2.0. Then I'd like to actually, just give you a sense of, because we're talking about the NPA, and I do fear that generally the common conversation, the public conversation does tend to get exaggerated. Towards that, if you look at the fundamentals of the economy, it is the fastest growing economy in the world. We have inflation under control. The fundamentals of the economy are quite solid. Okay? There are many factors, external factors, and in a long term, you will have to continually keep battling them and have best responses to those. But it is important to understand that engineering growth, as UPA 2 did, does have long-term costs. Okay? There is an organic way to grow, which is what you saw in the from 2000 onwards, right? Under NDA 1, you saw the initial reforms, where you saw fast, exponential growth for the first time. But after that, when you have this overheating and over-lending and this, what I call engineered growth, then the quality of the growth does suffer. And today, we are basically trying to clean up in terms of, if you look at this entire banking crisis. Now, it is not a peculiarly Indian problem. That's another thing I want to caution you about. In the US, after the financial crisis of 2008, they did have a program called the Troubled Assets Relief Program. So what was TARP all about? TARP in the US was about the Treasury, which is the finance ministry, working very closely with the central bank. And that's where I want to, sort of re-emphasize the point that some of these problems, whether it is an NPA or overheating, is not the responsibility only of the executive, which is just the government alone. It does include a concerted effort, as you saw in cases of US. Well, in case of China, again, they had a banking crisis. There was a overheating and excess capacity getting created. Of course, in China, there is an embargo on discussions around economy. So we know what China wants us to know. So we do not have forensics of what is, but we can learn from the US. And the TARP program does tell us that Finance Ministry and RBI have to work very closely to manage expectations of producers and consumers and the global markets, to basically highlight what the fundamentals of the economy are, which are quite solid. But beyond all of that, inclusive growth is not just the government's responsibility. It is definitely not about just entitling people through rights. After all, the RTE Act, if it is anything, we know that acts that cannot, in fact, rights which cannot be enforced, you can get people into the school, but the quality of the schooling suffers. So rights will only go that far, okay? Eventually, it is about citizens. And that is what we must call now the culture of growth. We have to get disciplined. We have to invest in education and health and so on. And that's where the productivity growth and future inclusion will come from. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamika. And thank you to all the panelists. We will now open the house for a Q&A. What we will do is that if you could raise your hands, and then I will get somebody to come over to you and ask you the question. But because I'm the moderator, I get the right to ask the first question. And my question is to Shamika. Shamika, you talked about infrastructure, and do please point out to whom the question is directed. It'll make my life easier. You talked about infrastructure, and you talked about the role of infrastructure, and then you talked about, how a breakout state of Uttarakhand, to which I belong. And I'll give you an example. If you go to an Uttarakhand, it's a very classic example. Yes, it's had great economic growth. Yes, it's built a lot of infrastructure, a lot of roads. But if you go through the state and you talk to every citizen, the one thing that you will find missing is that if anybody believes that if it is at all been inclusive economic growth. As a matter of fact, the economic growth has been so exclusive that we are seeing such huge social changes like migration from the villages. And
so the point about Uttarakhand, Shaurya, it's important that inclusion also, you have to talk about the regional variation in the state-wise. And that's where recognizing what the breakout states in the country, like Uttarakhand and Sikkim, we don't talk enough about Sikkim or Gujarat, unfortunately, lately, is that we do have some models of high growth. Okay? Now, the inclusion part, what you're talking about, I don't know which even country today would go out and say we have had the most inclusive growth. It's all relative, really. You have to look at it over the last, let's say, 15, 20 years. How are situations? What is the economic mobility? Do we see people gaining this opportunity and using this infrastructure to, in fact, get out of poverty? After all, there is a reason that India's poverty rates have fallen from 33 to 11% today. And the share of Uttarakhand, unfortunately, I don't have the number there.
But the question I ask you this is because it's equally important, if you talk about inclusive growth, that people must feel that they are part of that growth. Now, if it's all relative, then why is, even sometimes the discourse in the country where people feel that while we've had economic growth, nobody seems to be happy. And not just Uttarakhand, but, across the country.
That's a global phenomenon. I think generally we are despondent, we are unhappy, but, you have to take a long-term view of things. The world, and in India in particular, is going through a phase of prosperity which we have not had for thousands of years. Let's not lose sight of that reality. So we can quibble, and of course, a lot of it is self-reinforcing media and the quality of conversation and public discussions we have in India today. But it's important to keep the long-term perspective on things.
Okay, for not monopolizing this for too long, I will now open it to the audience. Hi. Acha. So 5 minutes more and then we will ask PIYUSH ji to come up on stage. Yes, good. The lady there in the first table, and then I'll come to you next. In that order.
Hi. As a fellow economist, I was right down the road at this India Mobile Conference, and they said, there's something that you guys need to know, which is a big risk that's coming out. And perhaps Shamika, one of you could take this question. Said that it's a $1 trillion digital economy that India is going to become in 2025, third largest startup hub. And somebody said that, Bangalore, Hyderabad can soon become the next San Francisco. But there's a huge risk that everyone seems to be flagging, which is the economic choice that India might make and the risk of having to use regulation to create more in situ economic avenues. The worry is that in the global economy, if India chooses to over-regulate growing sectors, there's going to be a breakdown and a cutting of that. And many people have said soft regulate, let's not regulate, but the reality seems very different with regulations in spectrums, competition commission, etc. So the question I ask the panel is this. There's obviously a trade-off, and perhaps a discussion is already going on, but what is the response to something so huge, such as the digital economy, which is watching us closely, it's global, and it gives us a great vantage point to deregulate. But would we choose to regulate in such a context?
You want to take?
Regulating by the way, show me one free market in the world, and I will relearn my economics. There is nothing called free market without regulation. In fact, for markets to work, you need regulation. You need the governments to do their job well. That's a very fundamental point. Secondly, there are global trends right now as far as the digital economy is concerned. Right now, we are going through this entire turmoil, if I may use, but also a re-emergence of a new world order, because data is becoming the new source of power. It's very important that India recognizes the power of data. We are the generators of the largest amount of data, which of course means we need more data scientists to transform data into knowledge or information. That's a separate R&D issue. But as far as regulating the digital economy is concerned, there is a lot of pushback from big American firms against regulation, which could be data localization and so on and so forth. But different economies are responding, which is according to their best interest. China has its own model. We are not China. But Europe has actually come up with fairly restrictive, but I think in the long term, preserving privacy, the GDPR. You have progressive open markets such as Canada, Australia, North Korea, Vietnam. They have all imposed certain forms of data localization. So it is a bit rich for people to come and tell us here that you are over-regulating. I think it's an important discussion, but there are truly national interests here at play. And it goes beyond the economy, because it's not very obvious to me what is the relationship of data firms to national security agencies globally. Thank you.
Maybe I'll add a little bit of a specific answer to what Shamika has said. There is a proposal for a new payments regulator, and that is to address this issue of the fact that the digital economy, and particularly the payment systems, have been over-regulated because the banking regulator was also the payments regulator and had a bias in favor of banks. Of course, that is being opposed by RBI, which doesn't want an independent payments regulator, and those turf wars will continue. But I think the government is responding very much to these questions, and this initiative of a new payments regulator is part of that response, that we need to regulate that system, yes, but not over-regulate the digital economy.
I think, yeah, we'll take the question from the table next. If you could just pass the mic to the lady there. Keep your questions short, please.
Hello, my name is Purvi. And as Shamika ma'am rightly said, that infrastructure is really very important for inclusiveness in the country. So my question is related to that topic. So in spite of investing almost 6% of GDP as infrastructure investment, which is quite good when we compare it with countries like Japan, Germany, etc. But our quality and quantity of infrastructure is not nearly as good as them. So my question is to all the panelists that what do you think that is going wrong, and how should we eradicate that problem, and what should be the way ahead? Thank you.
Anand?
Quality of infrastructure. Why do you think it's bad?
Okay, so on quality of infrastructure, first on the amount, so 6% for a country which has already built its infrastructure, whether it's Germany or Japan, is because they've already built their infrastructure. We are in fact going to be the biggest builder of new infrastructure anywhere in the world in the coming decade. So in the next 20 years, India will build more new infrastructure than any other country in the world. And we therefore have to invest much, much more than $1 trillion in 5 years. That's the estimate, so about $200 billion or so roughly per year. The quality of the infrastructure is something that there is efforts are being made to improve the quality. So whether it is through, there are various mechanisms. One is standards, that you try to increase the standards, because earlier standards were poorer, so we try to bring them up to the present international standards. Second, we are also trying to involve financial institutions into overlooking and monitoring the quality of the infrastructure that is being built. Because, you know, even when you set standards, somebody has to make sure that those standards are being met. In fact, 2 years ago, the Prime Minister has announced that India will lead a coalition of disaster-resilient infrastructure, an international coalition, where we'll try to bring expertise from other countries as well, so as to include the quality of infrastructure. Many countries, including Japan, have shown a lot of interest in our initiative, and looking forward, there is certainly going to be an attempt to improve quality.
Okay. I know there are a lot of other hands coming up, but in the interest of time, we've now got the Honorable Minister of Railways with us here. So may I request Shri PIYUSH Goyal ji to please come up on stage and deliver to us his keynote address on what is his idea of inclusive economic growth. And then we'll have him available for a Q&A as well.
Thank you very much, Shaurya. Distinguished panelists, this very important session. My colleague and senior leader, Shri Ram Madhavji, all the other distinguished ladies and gentlemen actively associated with the India Ideas Conclave 2018, ladies and gentlemen. As I was driving in here, I was just trying to reflect on what did we do differently from what was happening in the country for so many years. And has it been a business as usual scenario? Is it that governments come in and governments change, but ideas remain constant or almost constant? Or do we see a radical shift in both thinking and execution of ideas? And I felt that there was a dramatic shift both in concept, in the thinking behind this government's policies, in the execution of the policies, and in the objectives with which this government is carrying out its various activities. I'll give you a case in point since the last question related to infrastructure. I'll just give you a small case in point which occurred to me as I drove in, and Anuj is here, my colleague. I've just asked him to do a little bit of a research as we drove in on this subject. Shaurya, we have been investing in the railways over the last 70 years post-independence. Of course, the amounts were always very small. And as Ilaji rightly pointed out, a country which is at the development phase cannot afford to have small levels of investment in infrastructure. We'll have to go much more aggressive, somewhat keeping in mind the fact that this infrastructure will sustain growth and this infrastructure will enable a better quality of life for our people, which is that inclusive growth issue that you are discussing. But if we look at how we have invested in infrastructure and take the railways as just one example, over the last 65 years, every railway budget that came in was a political budget. The railway ministry was one of the most coveted ministries, irrespective of the number of accidents it may have had, because it gave you the clout to make humongous amounts of announcements. And when this government came in, we realized that we have announcements galore, whether for new rail lines, whether for tracks. Every conceivable announcement has been made, but has never been backed up with adequate funding. And given that you had projects which were, some of them were as old as of the 70s, which have not yet been completed. In fact, there's a project in West Bengal of the 70s, where I have now asked them to do a zero-based budgeting approach review, because that project, to my mind, can never come up. Whole townships have come up on the path that the railway was to take. So what eventually happened was, the budget became a political tool, based on which probably elections were fought and promises were made, knowing full well that this is never going to be implemented. If at all some of them were taken up for implementation, they were given paltry sums of money, which was barely enough to probably just keep the show going, the few officers busy, the security of the land, if any, acquired, some of the stock of tracks and all which are lying there, or the sleepers, maintain that. Don't know how much of it, in any case, got stolen. But nothing ever got completed. And if at all some things got done, it was the pace was very slow and very disjointed. Not necessarily to a game plan with an end objective in mind, but more whoever had the political clout at different points of time. And I think we frittered away a lot of resources. Projects kept getting into huge time and cost overrun. Investments made never reached in terms of benefit to the people of India. So the question of that inclusive growth was never really a material factor while deciding infrastructure investments. And we've landed up in a situation where today probably a railway minister would be the most unpopular minister because he's all the time hounded that, but this project has been approved in the budget of 2010, this project has been approved in the budget of 2007, etc., etc. Now, how do we explain to them, I have 1,000 projects which are approved? Mr. Modi changed the way the railways worked. First of all, we got rid of that budget so that that political interference can be mitigated, can be done away with. I think one of the biggest and probably elementary but most sensible reform was doing away with the railway budget so that we can focus our energies on what is already on the table. Second, we started prioritizing what is good for India, not what is good for any political class of people. And at least the last 4 years, we've had Rajya Sabha members heading the railway ministry, which by itself was a rarity if you look at that long list of railway ministers. So we don't have a political constituency per se to pander to or cater to. In any case, Mr. Modi would not allow that even if it was a Lok Sabha MP. And the study that I have asked my office to do is to check that we've invested about 2.5 times the amount in the railways alone on capex than what was invested between 2009 to 4. So 9 to 14, in the 5 years, UPA 2 invested about 2,30,000 crores in the capex of the railways. In our 5-year tenure, 14 to 19, including what we've budgeted this year, we would land up spending about 5,29,000 crores, which is about 2.5 times or 2.4 times what it was. But the difference that you will observe, and I can give you 100 examples standing right here, in the investments done in the last 4.5 years and which we have slated for the next 7, 8, 10 years as we have planned the progress of the railways, will show you a huge focus on 3 aspects. A, safety. Absolutely non-compromising effort to improve safety in the railways. B, passenger services, amenities. Can we make the passenger experience better? And C, focus on your return on investment. Are the lines, are the money that we are putting in really going to get you a good economic return? I mean, there were 14 lines which are going to transport coal, for example. They are all extremely viable lines. They have freight waiting to be transported. There's a huge shortage of coal. Large amounts of coal continue to be imported. Transport is one of the bottlenecks amongst others. But these lines have been languishing for years and years. A focused approach on completing those 14 lines, even though they've already had nearly a 3x or 5x cost overrun, but be that as it may, we don't have a choice anymore. But a completion of these projects in time will help move power, will help move coal. Coal will help provide power. Power will transform the lives of the citizens of India. And Saubhagya within the next 4 or 5 months will ensure every willing consumer in the country will get power at his home. Every single willing consumer. I have used the word willing consumer when we drafted that about 2 years ago. Because if somebody just doesn't apply for a connection, we should not have a particular journalist go with a mic, shove it up the mouth of the resident of that home and say, but you don't have power here. So clearly the guy has to be a willing consumer, he has to make an application. But then all of this is intertwined. You can't give an electricity connection to everybody unless you are sure at the back end you've provided enough power generation and transmission ability. You can't guarantee power generation unless you've made sure You have a project pipeline for thermal and now for solar, wind, hydro, enough to ensure that we never run out of power or we don't have power shortages. And it is this holistic thinking of what is best for the common man, for the poorest of the poor in this country, pursuing the agenda that Pandit Dindayal Upadhyay articulated in Integral Humanism. Prime Minister Modi has focused on a variety of programs which collectively bring about not only growth, but truly inclusive growth, which collectively prepare India for sustainable growth in the years ahead, which prepare India with infrastructure, much needed infrastructure, to ensure that people get a good quality of life, simultaneously making India a power to reckon with in the Comity of Nations internationally. And I think it's this 360-degree approach to issues which has been a significant shift in policy, significant shift in execution, that truly has made a difference to the lives of the people of India. I remember the promise of universal power, access to power for every home, was announced by the National Advisory Council. It was the NAC, right? Those days. By all those announcements, in any case, made by the NAC, the Prime Minister did not have much role in that. But Mrs. Sonia Gandhi had made an announcement that by 2009, every home will get power. We didn't see that happening till 2014. And figures seem to suggest, some reports seem to suggest that around 2012, 11-12, we had nearly 300 million people without electricity, which is about 55, 60 million homes, or 65 million homes. This government looked at that very systematically in a focused manner, and with a 5-year deadline, that okay, we are in this term of office, we have 5 years with us. We focused on fuel supply, focused on generation, ensured that we expand the transmission grid. Today we have one nation, one grid. You can get power across the nation at one price. Power can flow in different directions whenever required. Then we worked on the distribution. What we can do to strengthen it. I think nearly $20 billion worth of support the central government gave to the states to strengthen the distribution networks. First focus to make sure every village gets electricity. Then looked at the hamlets, the dhola, the dhanis and tolas and all around the village. Very often people get confused. When we say a village got electrified, they say, but I have 1,000 villages in my constituency not electrified. Those are actually those adjoining small areas, hamlets around a village, around a revenue village. So we made sure that we next take electricity to each one of those. And now in a focused way, we are ensuring that every single home, and I'm delighted to share with you Madhya Pradesh. I don't know, is there a model code of conduct constraint here? But I don't think so in Delhi. But Madhya Pradesh has only 4 days back sent me a message that Madhya Pradesh, every household has got electrified in the state. Bihar is on the anvil. Probably another month by 30th November, at best by December. Bihar will have every single home with electricity. And the story goes on, and before we get into the next financial year, we would have had electricity reach every single home. Cooking gas. Who would have imagined that a nation which gave about 120 million gas connections in decades of this program will give another 120 million in 5 years. I don't think anybody would have ever imagined this scale of rollout to ensure that what Mr. Modi and his mother and his sister went through, no other woman in this country will have to go through. Taking digital technology to the remotest corners of this country within 5 years is certainly a program none of us in this room had imagined is feasible in such a short span of time. But dedicated focus on implementation and you spoke about regulation. I think this government is one government which has kept minimum new regulators, new regulations coming in. We are on the contrary trying to see how we can strengthen the existing regulation system or make it easier for regulators today. For example, I'll give you a simple example. Earlier, a decision of the Central Power Regulator, CERC, was not automatically binding all over the country. So if you had a similar issue, which 100 power plants had, you needed 100 cases to be decided, discussed, adjudicated, and each one would take a decision, sometimes contrary to each other, then go back to the court, tribunal, then go to the Supreme Court, and years would pass of indecisiveness. A regulation was brought in that a central regulator's decision can automatically flow to all similar cases. This is a minor example I'm just sharing with you. What I'm only trying to say is that this kind of holistic thinking, Swachhata, a clean India, something which many people ridiculed, little realizing that that was something so dear even to the father of the nation, that he said Swachhata is above godliness, cleanliness is above godliness. भगवान की पूजा बाद में करेंगे, पहले स्वच्छ बनाओ अपने आंगन को, प्रांगण को. And clearly all the economists here I'm sure will appreciate the impact, the huge social impact a clean India will have even on the economic well-being of this country, on health costs, on the way we think and live. Again, we may have naysayers who will always find fault with everything. But that is where we need a positive thinking community or a positive thinking intelligentsia to be able to articulate all this to the rest of the country. So people don't get swayed by false propaganda or by false commentary. I remember in one of my interviews on a show, Uday Bhai will remember it, when I was sitting on the stage and I was questioned about one of these programs, I don't know whether it was electricity or Ujjwala, that, oh, but so and so place, the people have not got electricity. And by chance, just like you have a small, I think, cashew nut lying just a little ahead of Ilaji, at that time there was some small piece of paper, smaller than this, which was lying somewhere around. It was much smaller than this, half the size of this actually. You remember that, Uday Bhai? And I said, yaar, ye program ke organizers ne kaam acha nahi kiya. कहाँ सफाई भी नहीं रख सके, 5-star होटल में प्रोग्राम है और ये कचरे का पीस देखो स्टेज के ऊपर पड़ा है. Now is that the view one should take, or one should look at the beautiful to my mind, when we are talking of inclusive growth, and we are talking of growth reaching to the last man at the bottom of the pyramid, to the remotest village in Arunachal Pradesh and Sikkim, when we are looking at the development of the nation as a whole, particularly Northeast India and the eastern parts of India, which have remained deprived of growth for, as our younger sister said, not only decades or centuries, but probably thousands of years. How long, after all, will we keep remembering Takshashila or Nalanda and all? We'll have to look at today, and we'll have to address the challenges of today. While we are proud of our heritage and tradition, we can draw a lot from that tradition and that heritage. But action will have to be today. And I think, to my mind, what Mr. Modi presented to this country was an action-oriented government focused on translating his ideas or his vision for a better tomorrow for 1.25 billion people into action on the ground, in ensuring that every single citizen gets the fruits of development, infrastructure reaches every single village in the country. And with that in mind, the vision that he articulated of a new India by 2022, when we turn 75, an India where every single citizen has a roof over his head, an India where every single citizen's home has a toilet. Nearly 82 million toilets have been made in the last 4 years. 82 million, more than that were made in 60 years, 65 years. Where every single home gets electricity round the clock, has clean drinking water, has road access not only to the village under our rural roads program started by Mr. Vajpayee, but access right up to his home, where quality of education and healthcare using modern technology, particularly through the vast spread of digital technologies across the country, we can give good quality healthcare, good quality education to every citizen, promoting micro, small and medium enterprises in a big way so that they engage with the formal economy, they get money from the formal banking system and are not dependent on money lenders for their subsistence. They connect with the digital world also to become providers through e-commerce, through the GEM portal, through various ways by which an artisan or a craftsman in Varanasi or in Tiruchirappalli can also probably be a supplier globally. That vision being translated into action on the ground has been our mantra for the last 5 years. And towards that mantra, the enormous strides we have made, in some sense, beating every single date that the Sustainable Development Goals had articulated in 2015-16, where the United Nations came out with 17 goals. But most of them culminating somewhere in 2030. But a man in a hurry at the helm of affairs in India, who believes that every single day lost in the life of a young child in a remote village in India is national capital being wasted. Just to bring in a little economist jargon, because I don't know much of economics. Every single hour of a lady in the house wasted is national capital being wasted. Our resources losing their value. And therefore when we, and then the prioritizing of issues. After all, unless power reaches every single home, digital cannot follow. Quality education cannot follow. Connectivity cannot be improved. Healthcare cannot be improved. Unless healthcare is provided for, the lifespan or quality of life of a citizen cannot be improved. Given the current status of education, digital is the only way where we can monitor programs and we can ensure high quality education reach every part of the country. So electricity, digital, ensuring healthcare, making the woman's life more comfortable, ensuring that opportunities are provided across the length and breadth of the country so everybody doesn't move towards urban agglomerates. You don't overcrowd the cities. Wherever cities have a crowd, what can we do with that? How can we provide affordable housing to them? What can we do with local transport? Can metros go across the length and breadth of the cities which are overcrowded? I mean, Mumbai now is planning the 4th and 5th metro line. Railways is investing nearly 75,000 crores in Mumbai, not because I am from Mumbai, because 1/3 of the passengers of railways are from Mumbai. Out of 22 million passengers, 7 million passengers every day travel in the Mumbai suburban. You can't have them losing their lives every day. I've myself hung on to the gate, at the gate to the chain, for 8 years of my student life, every morning and evening. And towards that end, this kind of holistic development agenda, which Prime Minister Modi and the government of the day has prepared, has been articulated at various forums. Report card has been presented to the citizens of India every single year. On the 26th of May, every year for the last 4 years, we've gone back to the people with a report card. And the kind of monitoring of all these programs, the kind of effort to hold people accountable to the success of these programs, the kind of transparency and corruption-free environment that is being sought to be provided and effort made in that direction, to my mind is unparalleled when we look at India's history of 7 decades. And I'm very confident that the ideas that come out of such a conclave, and I've had a chance to read some of the recommendations that were made in your earlier conclaves, of course in better surroundings than the one this time. And I was looking forward to come to Goa, by the way, this time. I think it's unfortunate that I haven't had a chance to actually attend your conclaves earlier. But I'm delighted to see that the kind of recommendations, the kind of ideas that are collated through the exchanges that you have here, the kind of feedback that we get from the speakers or the participants of the conclaves really help us in policy making, really help us in going back to the drawing board sometimes to relook at what could be done better, what can be done differently. And that has been the differentiating factor of this government, a government responsive to citizen feedback, a government responsive to ideas that come out of even the media, for example, a government where we spend a lot of time engaging with stakeholders to understand what they feel is good for them. Of course, we've done some things which some people have not found very palatable. But I think that was the need of the hour. Somebody had to bite the bullet. Otherwise, we would have had one more government with a business as usual scenario. I'm delighted that the governance deficit that we have been able to remove, or I would say reduce substantially in the last 4.5 years of this government, will certainly prepare India, will certainly empower India for decades and decades of prosperity in the years ahead. Before I conclude, I'd like to correct a mistake I made, which my colleague just pointed out. I'm delighted to share with you that Bihar has had 100% household electrification yesterday. A good 2 months ahead of schedule. Something that this government has focused on, time-bound execution of big ideas. What is that word? Bhag. Big, hairy, audacious goals. That's what this government likes to take up. Really big and very audacious goals. But for us, Bhag is not running away. Bhag for us is participation. हम सब मिलके भाग लेते हैं इन बड़े उद्देश्यों को पूरी तरीके से सफल बनाने में. ये सरकार किसी विषय से भागती नहीं है. आप सबके साथ सम्मिलित होकर भाग लेके सभी कार्यक्रमों को सफल बनाती है. और ये सरकार की भूमिका रही है 4.5 साल की. और मुझे पूरा विश्वास है कि आप सबके जो आइडियाज आए हैं, जो आप सबकी सोच है, उसको हम और आगे कैसे बढ़ा सकें, उसमें ये सरकार संकल्पित रहेगी. बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद.
Thank you very much, PIYUSH ji. Please come. we'll do a little bit of formality. There was a very impassioned speech about how the role of having the correct niti and niyati both is important for inclusive economic growth. Now, I don't know how much time. I think we have time for just literally 2 questions from the audience. So I see one hand there. And please be very short in your question. Be very pointed to whom the question is directed.
Hello, this is Murli here. Mr. Marathe spoke about moving away from employability to income-generating opportunities, and Shamika spoke about investment into soft infrastructure. My question is related to the two. As a part of the soft infrastructure, you emphasized on health a lot, but the other area is about education, where don't you think that there is a need now to move away from the current structure of education right at school level to make it more skill and vocation based, whereby what I'm trying to suggest is that provide them with a basic education which leads them to basic mathematics, basic literacy, and then move them, at least offer opportunities to the students to take up vocations like, say, plumbing or electrician's work or something like that. My thought process is coming from the fact that if somebody is in future going to become a plumber or something, what is that person going to do by reading advanced calculus or trigonometries and stuff like that, which he is currently forced to in schools as he goes around?
Okay. Yeah. Anyone of you want to take the question?
First of all, in education, there is a lot of research which at a systems level, which says that, education can either be a spider model, and spider weaves a very complex web to sustain one spider. Or you have a starfish model. If you cut a starfish into 5, you have 5 new starfish. So you will have to allow for different models to emerge. It is quite possible that that kid who hates his calculus class could perhaps be the mathematicians of tomorrow. That's number 1. Number 2, skills are very important. In fact, skills are a part of the current school education. It needs further bolstering, and that's where you have a series of, in fact, Atal Mission is exactly about imparting skills at the school level, which can then benefit them in future employability.
The gentleman on the last.
Just supplement one thing. When Prime Minister was Chief Minister of Gujarat, he had a study conducted on how many different vocations or skills impact a person's life from the time a child is conceived till a person dies or a few days thereafter. If I remember correctly, some 5,000 different skills were identified which touch our lives through our lifespan. Which is why the only one ministry we've started in this 5 years is the Skill Development and Entrepreneurship Ministry. There's a huge focus on that. But that does not take away the importance of basic education. After all, we've all gone through school. School teaches you certain things like discipline, opens your mind to a certain way of living, working, thinking. Unfortunately, many schools today don't have moral science lectures or civics lectures. It's a very sad thing. I think that's something we should try and once again bring back very aggressively. Of course, there's the risk of people saying you're trying to bring in religion and stuff like that, but I think it's very unfair criticism. I went to a Christian school where there was a lecture on moral science for us. And during that lecture, the Christian students would go to the church in my school. So it was a very beautiful arrangement. I don't know how much today in schools we focus on physical education and sports. This government is trying to inculcate the habit of sport in a big way. I mean, one of my companies in coal has partnered with Jharkhand government. We have 358 Adivasi and children from the remotest corners of Jharkhand. 358 students selected through a videographed transparent process who are being trained in that sports academy. And I had an occasion to visit it 3 weeks ago. It was probably one of the most satisfying visits I've had to any of my units. 358 students, they were between 8 and 12. We are picking them young. providing the best of quality of nutrition, healthcare, education in good schools in the neighborhood, DAV schools or Kendriya Vidyalayas or Delhi Public School, that kind of quality of schools there. But training them up to be sportsperson in whichever field they are interested in. So I think you need to develop, going forward, a mix of formal education coupled with skill development and vocational training to choose what the person likes, something like the Three Idiots story, and prepare individuals. And that will provide, to my mind, millions, if not tens of millions of working opportunities, as Satishji rightly said.
Yeah, the question, gentleman in the last table. That's the last question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm concerned that in the quest for GDP growth, we seem to be missing out on monitoring and safeguarding our natural capital, which is our environment, our natural resources, our forests, pasture lands, glaciers, watersheds, and everything that the very many self-help groups and cooperative societies that Dr. Marathe spoke about so convincingly, that they depend on to apply their knowledge and to produce the products for which he is suggesting that they get a little more than they already do. Now, there is and has been for the last 10 to 15 years a focus and a drive in international economics towards bringing in the valuation of ecosystems. This is something that, in fact, even Ministry of Statistics has been participating in together with UN Statistics. I am associated with UNESCO, and we work on this as well. The circular economy concept and the variations thereof, which we find in several of the countries which are post-industrial, are already 10 years to 15 years old. And I am somewhat concerned that we don't seem to be going in this direction, nor do we seem to be having a discussion about it in a rational way, without saying that GDP growth has to be above all. Mr. Minister, I'd like to know what you think about this.
Well, I had the good fortune to be a part of the delegation that was at COP21 with the Prime Minister. And frankly, that was one day in my life where I really realized what a 56-inch chest is. Every single world leader at Paris was looking up to Prime Minister Modi's leadership to make that agreement happen and to bring about consensus. And I think what we achieved in Paris, where we were able to bring about a positive affirmation of climate justice, was probably one of the most important elements of India's contribution to protect the developing world from, I would say, persecution by the developed world when it comes to balancing the needs of development and the needs of climate change. Despite the fact that even today, in 2018, India consumes less coal per capita than the United States used to consume in the 1860s, a good 150 years ago. Despite the fact that we are at the cusp of a massive thrust of development, where we need low-cost energy, which sometimes compromises with the environment. Sometimes, I said, not always. Despite the fact that we have not contributed to this problem in the first place, despite having 17% of the world population, India's contribution to this problem is barely 2%. Whereas the Europe and America together have contributed over half the carbon emissions that we have up there. Despite all of this, despite the fact that you and I are trained from childhood that when we leave a room, we switch off the light or switch off the fan, otherwise your mother will come and point it out to you. Why is it not off? Whereas you go to any city in the world, be it Sydney, be it Tokyo, be it London, be it New York, Washington, or any other important international city, you will find 100-story buildings empty the whole night, office buildings, government buildings, brightly lit up because they look nice. It gives a skyline. It gives beauty to that city. Little caring for the contribution to climate change and the carbon emissions that causes. Despite all of this, today India has embarked on one of the biggest renewable energy program ever embarked in the history of mankind. We have taken on a commitment to reduce our contribution of carbon emissions relative to our GDP by 30 to 35%, one of the most aggressive contributions which no other country in the world has taken up. On a personal note, Prime Minister Modi is looking at trying to do better than that. We have looked at a huge program for regeneration of our forests and increasing our green cover, creating another 2 or 3 billion tons of carbon sink. No other country has such an ambitious program as that. And despite the fact that the polluters of the world are backing out of their commitments to climate change, India is going ahead, full stream ahead, more aggressively than even what we had committed. And I'm happy to share with you the Indian Railways is not only going to eliminate diesel engines and go in for 100% electrification, the first railway in the world, nowhere in the world a railway of our size has 100% electrification. The US is barely 2% electrified, 2%. But apart from the 100% electrification, we'll soon be coming out with a 20 gigawatt renewable energy procurement program by which in the next 10 years, I hope to make Indian Railways a net zero emitter of carbon emissions. I dare say no other country in the world has such ambitious plans to protect and preserve the environment while ensuring a better quality of life, while ensuring growth for our people that India has. And we can all be proud of that.
Now I request Shaurya ji to felicitate the guest to present the memento to Shri PIYUSH Goyal ji. To Professor Ila Patnaik, to Shri Ananta, to Shri Satish Marathe ji, to Mrs. Shamika Ravi, I'll request Shri Alok Bansal ji to give the memento to Shri Shaurya ji. There will be a break for 20 minutes. We'll again assemble for the next session which will start at 4:30.